Please. Do not make me let you down.
X-Men 97 Episode 2 was an emotional roller coaster that I was not ready for. Therefore, in the sake of therapy, let's break down all of the small details that you might have missed along the way. Because obviously, for my mental health and yours. Salutations and fist bumps, folks. Welcome back to the grid. Let's get right into this again for therapy reasons. In our recap, in the beginning of this episode, we hear the first voice of Magneto.
Previously on X-Men.
Which is something to keep in mind from the start to the end of this episode, because everything hinges on Magneto and what he says or does in this episode. Because if you didn't figure this out by now, he is the de facto leader of the X-Men because of Charles's will and testament. Also in the credits, is that Genosha? And if it is, that further coincides with the fact that Magneto is the leader of the X-Men and possibly the reason why he further helps a group that we saw earlier or in the first episode underneath a sewer, who is basically being captured or has been captured by FOH. And in the early report from the Ferris wheel scene, we hear that Magneto once went missing or had been missing since Charles's death.
And humans aided and saved by the former mutant terrorist who'd gone missing after failing.
Then, during the powwow between the X-Men about Magneto, we hear Mark Twain being quoted by Beast, which is obviously fitting for this moment because throughout the years, Magneto has been the main foe for the X-Men. And the saying goes, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Later, does it seem like Rogue was trying to smooth things over for Eric when they're trying to understand what or why he's doing what he's doing? Because no one in that room calls him by his actual name except for her. So red flags, anybody? Definitely one for Gambit.
She belongs to the streets.
Then again, we hear Magneto use the phrase my X-Men, which again comes from the very first iteration of the X-Men comic. Then when Scott tells Jean to take Cerebro and figure out what's going on inside of Magneto's mind, she doesn't want to touch that thing at all because of what she's experienced before. And I do believe that that is probably a encountering of some other person that she or someone created. Then we get a moment between Storm and Jean where she remembers the green suit that she wore during the Phoenix and Dark Phoenix saga. And she mentions how Scott came to her rescue multiple times over and over and over again, which we may see again. And during those sagas, it was basically a given that she was going to leave the X-Men and probably or possibly not come back at all. But she does, and it's kind of a foreshadowing moment for Storm because of what happens later. But inside of this moment, we can see the introspection of these two characters, these friends, that we don't necessarily get a whole lot of before this moment on screen. And in this conversation, Jean mentions that what she felt inside of Gyric's mind possibly, or at least in my opinion, again, or it is believed by me, that she encounters someone or something that comes from a different place. Then we fast forward to Rogue and Magneto having a nightcap type of moment, which before now, no one really knew about inside of the X-Men rank. But in the comics, their first official meeting occurred when Rogue lost her powers in 1991's Uncanny X-Men 274, after which she joined Magneto and his cause to turn the Savage Land, a tropical preserve on Antarctica, into a mutant utopia. In this storyline, since she did not have her powers, she was able to make physical contact with Eric, which ultimately leads the two to develop a romantic relationship because of that. But that ends abruptly when Magneto kills Aladan, prompting Rogue to question her affection for Eric. But this isn't the first time that they've been in a slight situationship, because it's happened multiple times inside of the comics, specifically inside of Age of X. Then the good guys show up.
You were saying?
Come on, Scott, you were doing so well. But this man Magneto was playing Tonka toys with their choppers because he literally turns them on their heads and was about to chop them into pieces. Then as everyone heads to the UN trial, Wolverine tells Jean that Scott has now gone with everyone in the crew, and Jean had no idea about that, which Wolverine brings that up to her, saying that everyone didn't know, or pseudo saying that everyone didn't know that they were about to leave, even though he did. And we can slightly catch a glimpse of the fact that Wolverine possibly, well, definitely still has feelings for Jean, which is another historical moment from the comics because at one point, everybody was trying to come at Jean, including the professor. During the trial, though, Magneto mentions that his people, his original people, were targeted because they dared to call God by a different name, which, by the way, if you don't know, he is a survivor of Auschwitz, which gives another layer to his mutant loyalty because he always felt like he was an outsider. We also see old Blabbermouth from the first episode, the Executioner. And if you pay close attention to what Rogue says and doesn't say, you can see that she actually wants Magneto to come out of this pretty well. Oh, and then this moment between Jean and Wolvie.
He's here!
Apocalypse?
The baby!
Oh my goodness!
Hilarious, because this man is absolutely clueless to the fact of what is going on inside of her body right now, because he thinks that Apocalypse has just shown up, and that is not the case at all.
You ain't just whistling Dixie!
But you would think that he would possibly even know this or be able to sense it because there is a chemical change in her body. But he's so clueless, he thinks Apocalypse just showed up and is ready to fight. And then the roof comes off of the car. I'm going to do that every time that it happens inside of this episode because it's the 90s. It just makes sense. But it comes off because of Jean screaming because she's in labor. Now, I can't shake the fact that the storming of the UN came from a real place because it really seems very similar to something that happened a few years ago. Oh, and by the way, if you weren't keeping track, this is around the third act, which actually bleeds in to the fourth. And during this moment, we see Morph change into Lady Deathstrike and Colossus. And of course, my favorite line of this entire episode comes from none other than Storm, when she turns, fires, and says to the UN leaders,
"Do not think. Be silent. Heed my commands and you shall survive."
Shut it up, Talbot. You always got something negative to say. People out here enjoying their life, doing what they love.
And now I am convinced that she is the mother of the X-Men at this point because she is on point with telling them or telling anybody about themselves and reading them from top to bottom. Then in the hospital, we finally hear Rogue say what maybe everyone has been waiting on her to say.
Sorry, sugar.
Ooh, yes, Lord. Now, remember how I mentioned a little bit ago that the third act bleeds into the fourth a little bit in this episode? It comes to a culmination inside of the UN meeting, specifically at the trial, because as the protesters storm the doors, and possibly actually a little bit before it, we then figure out or become aware of who the bad guy is, and that's again old Blabbermouth, the Executioner. And in the battle that comes up with Scott and him, we come face to face with him for the very first time, at least in his full armed garb and everything like that. Then when Storm and Magneto come together to fight against the insertion, they do so with a combined front, and everyone around them is slightly doing the same thing, but in different parts of this area. But also another battle is being fought with Scott and Rogue and Jean, which at this point is the birth of their baby. But the common foe at this point, or the one that becomes the common foe at this point, is the shot heard round the world at Storm, because that brings everybody to a head, specifically Magneto. Then the scene where she says that she can no longer feel the breeze, bruh. You know that stomach feeling that you get when you hear really bad news? That's exactly how I felt in that moment, and I'm sure you did too. But then as Magneto carries the UN leaders above the earth, he toys with them And this is probably the most intellectual insulting that I've ever heard from anybody. And then again, my second favorite line of this episode has to come from Magneto right here, because he tells the UN leaders and old Blabbermouth that the promise that he made to his friend Charles is what he's trying to stand on, or trying to stand on business at this point. And then he pleads with them saying, please don't make me let you down, which is a double entendre on the fact that he doesn't want to fail against the X-Men in terms of what his promise is with human and mutant relations, and he doesn't also want to let them down physically, because that would be the end of all of them. Then we hear the name Nathan Charles Summers, or Nathan C. Summers, for the first time in this episode, which tells us that what's coming up next, or coming up later, is more than likely Apocalypse at some point, because that is one of the storylines that we could possibly go down, and specifically with him at the forefront. Now that we're here, let's talk about that ending, shall we? First, as Jean brings Storm what looks like tea, she puts the tea down with her powers in favor of Storm's letter, who in the latter parts of this episode, we hear her actual name, Aurora, multiple times in this episode, specifically at the end when Beast says it, and also when she signs her letter at the end as Jean is reading it. But in her letter, she describes that Jean and her are no longer connected, because at this point they aren't, and it's something that we weren't even ready for either, because at this point Storm now feels out of place again, now having to start a new life or something of that sort, which is something that she wasn't ready to do, and we weren't ready to do that with her either. But then Scott does his Scott thing and decides that he should have tried even harder to actually be there for his team. And then Bishop tells him, bro, you did exactly what you were supposed to do. You had a baby. But then when Gambit side eyes Magneto, it comes from the fact that he just saw his lady creeping out of the professor's old office with none other than Magneto, and he knows it, and I do believe that Magneto actually reads his mind as he tells him that it should have been him being shot instead of Storm. Because do you see the way that that man glares at him as he says this? But then there's a knock on the door, and everyone, including me, thought that it was going to be Storm running back into the arms of the X-Men once again, being possibly even optimistic about her outlook on her new life that possibly could come back. But we were all shocked when we saw that it was Jean, or someone that looks like her. I say that because when she goes into Gyric's mind, her vision shows a different person behind her that has similar eyes but looks slightly off. So either it's an alter ego, or she comes into contact with a part of herself that may have been cloned. Well, X-Men 97 has not and probably will not disappoint, at least not yet. And if you're feeling nostalgic at this point, go ahead and click this video right up here. And until next time, y'all be smooth. Blurred out.